Welcome, everyone. Um, Before we even get started today, I just want to pause and offer a real, genuine blessing for you.
I love that.
Yeah, may God deeply bless your day today, and may that blessing really just carry you through your entire week ahead. We are thrilled to have you joining us for this deep dive.
It's great to be here with you.
Today, our mission is to unpack a truly fascinating piece of ancient text. We're looking at Matthew chapter 22. And to make sure we are extracting the absolute best historical and theological insights, we're pulling from the rich scholarly notes found in two major sources.
Right, the Holman Study Bible and the NAA,
Exactly. The Nova Almeida Actualizada Study Bible.
which are both fantastic resources. To truly appreciate what we're looking at today, we really have to properly set the stage.
Yeah, context is everything here.
It is. If you just casually read through Matthew 22, it might feel like a somewhat random collection of parables and religious debates, but the context completely changes the tone.
Because he's not just sitting on a hill teaching.
Right. Far from it. This is not a relaxed teaching session on a picturesque hillside. This is a high-stakes, incredibly tense intellectual battlefield. Jesus is in his final days before the crucifixion.
Right, in the heart of Jerusalem.
Exactly. And he is facing a coordinated, rapid-fire series of hostile interrogations. Various religious and political factions who historically cannot stand one another have actually teamed up.
Which is wild in itself.
It really is. And their singular, desperate goal is to publicly discredit him, trap him in a treasonous statement, or just find a definitive legal reason to arrest him for sedition.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the way he navigates this gauntlet is essentially a masterclass in rhetoric and crisis management.
Oh, absolutely.
The chapter kicks off with Jesus telling a highly provocative story, the parable of the wedding banquet.
Right?
He describes a king who is throwing a massive wedding feast for his son. He sends out his servants with invitations, but the selected guests just flat out refuse to come.
They completely brush it off.
Yeah, they go back to their farms, their businesses, and incredibly, some of them even attack and murder the royal messengers who brought the invitation.
And to an ancient audience, the meaning of this allegory would have been immediately clear. It was a direct, pointed challenge to the establishment.
How do the study Bibles break that down?
Well, when we look at how the sources decode the symbolism, it paints a very stark picture. The king represents God. The son is Jesus himself. The servants delivering those invitations are the prophets of the Old Testament who historically faced violent rejection.
Right, they were not treated well.
No, they weren't. And those initial invited guests who brushed off the royal summons, they represent Israel, and specifically the religious elite standing right in front of him who were actively rejecting the Messiah.
The king's reaction in the story, though, is severe. He is furious. He sends his army, destroys the murderers, and burns their city to the ground.
It's intense.
That feels like a massive military escalation for simply declining a wedding RSVP.
It definitely sounds extreme to our modern ears. But in the ancient Near East, refusing a royal invitation wasn't just a social misstep.
It was a big deal.
It was considered a dangerous public insult and an act of outright treason against the crown. You are essentially denying the king's authority.
Wow.
Furthermore, both study Bibles highlight something incredible about that specific detail of the burning city. This is widely understood by scholars as a direct prophetic allusion to a very real historical event.
The destruction of Jerusalem.
Exactly. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army in 70 AD, which would happen roughly 4 decades after Jesus told this story.
So he's looking right at his interrogators and predicting the catastrophic fallout of their rejection.
He is.
But the narrative of the parable doesn't end with the burning city. After the original guests are destroyed, the king says, "Fine, invite everyone you can find on the streets, good and bad."
And the banquet hall fills up.
It does. But then we hit this major plot twist. The king comes in to greet his new guests, and he spots a man who isn't wearing wedding clothes.
Right, the famous wedding garment.
He asks him how he got in without the proper attire. The man is completely speechless, and the king immediately orders him to be tied up and thrown out into the outer darkness.
Which is a chilling conclusion.
It really is. And if you read this through a modern lens, it feels incredibly harsh. The guy gets thrown out into the darkness over a dress code violation. A casual reader might think, well, maybe he was just poor and pulled off the street.
And that is the absolute most common modern misconception. But the cultural context completely flips this narrative.
How so?
The study Bibles note that in the ancient Near East, when a wealthy king or nobleman threw a grand royal feast like this, he did not expect the common people pulled from the highways to have royal wedding attire in their closets.
Right, they wouldn't own anything like that.
Exactly. The host would actually provide the festive garments for the guests at the door.
Oh, wow. So the man wasn't thrown out because he lacked the financial means to buy a suit.
Precisely. He was thrown out because he actively, deliberately refused to wear the garment the king had graciously provided for him.
He wanted to do it his way.
He wanted to attend the king's feast on his own terms, in his own everyday clothes. It was an arrogant insult to the host's hospitality.
And the theological meaning there is pretty deep.
Very deep. The sources explain that this wedding garment represents true faith, repentance, and the righteousness that is provided entirely by God, not earned or manufactured by us.
So the lesson is that it's not enough to simply show up.
Right. Or to claim a superficial association with the kingdom. There has to be a genuine acceptance of what God provides. That is what leads to the famous, sobering conclusion of the parable. Many are invited, but few are chosen.
It's fascinating to watch the political dynamics shift right after he drops that heavy parable. His opponents immediately realize they need a better strategy, which brings us to the first major trap.
And it is a brilliant trap.
The text tells us the Pharisees team up with the Herodians. Historically, we know these two groups despised each other.
Hated each other.
The Pharisees were strict religious purists who deeply hated the Roman occupation and believed Israel should be politically independent.
And the Herodians were on the total opposite end.
Right, they were a political faction who supported the Roman-backed Herodian dynasty. They were essentially viewed as corrupt collaborators by the purists.
And that unholy alliance is exactly what makes their trap so dangerous. They approach Jesus, attempt to butter him up by praising how honest and impartial he is, and then they drop an absolute bombshell of a question.
Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?
Yes.
To really grasp the weight of this, we have to understand why this specific poll tax was so incendiary. This wasn't just an annoyance. It was a physical and financial burden that had actually sparked violent Jewish uprisings in the past.
Like during the census of Quirinius.
Exactly. So if Jesus answers, yes, pay the tax, he instantly alienates the Jewish common people who were suffering under Rome and viewed the tax as a betrayal of God's sovereignty.
And his popular support would just vanish.
Which was his main protection at this point.
Precisely. But if he answers, no, do not pay the tax, the Herodians are standing right there specifically to witness it.
They'd run straight to the authority.
Immediately, they would run to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and have Jesus arrested and executed for inciting rebellion, tax evasion, and treason against the Roman Empire.
It is a perfectly constructed lose-lose legal snare.
They are completely convinced they have him cornered.
But Jesus sees right through the malice. He doesn't just answer their question, he demands a visual prop. He says, show me the coin used for the tax.
And they hand him a denarius.
When you dig into the historical context provided by the study notes, you get a really clear picture of what this specific piece of silver represented. It wasn't just neutral currency.
Far from neutral.
It had the profile image of Emperor Tiberius stamped right on it. The Latin inscription translated to Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, and on the reverse side, it carried the title High Priest.
Which is just explosive.
To a devout Jewish person, holding this coin was holding physical, state-sponsored idolatry. It was imperial propaganda declaring a human ruler to be a literal god.
And just by making them produce the coin, Jesus is subtly exposing their deep hypocrisy.
Because they have it right there in the temple.
Exactly. They are standing in the sacred temple precincts, and these supposedly pure religious leaders are carrying this idolatrous Roman propaganda right in their own pockets. They are already participating in the system they're trying to trap him with.
He looks at the coin and asks them, whose image and inscription is this? They answer, Caesar's.
And then Jesus delivers one of the most famous and brilliantly evasive lines in recorded history. Give then to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It is a stunning rhetorical pivot, but it's also a profound philosophical and theological statement about the relationship between the citizen and the state.
The study Bibles really break this down.
They do. They explain that by acknowledging the coin bears Caesar's image and inscription, Jesus is validating that the civil government does have a legitimate, albeit highly limited, sphere of authority. If you use Caesar's roads, his protection, and his economic system, you owe him his tax.
But the second half of that sentence is the real theological earthquake here.
Yeah.
And to God, the things that are God's.
Because it demands, we ask the obvious follow-up question, what belongs to God?
Well, if the coin bears Caesar's image, what bears God's image? If we look back to the very beginning of the Torah, Genesis chapter 1, it explicitly states that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God.
That is the core of it.
Therefore, while you might owe the Roman Empire a few silver coins for societal upkeep, you owe your entire life, your soul, and your ultimate allegiance to the Creator, whose image is permanently stamped upon your very being.
The state has a claim on your wallet, but only God has a claim on your worship. It completely defangs their trap. Matthew records that they were absolutely amazed by this answer, and they just left him and went away.
The Pharisees and Herodians fail, but the ink is barely dry on that defeat when a completely different faction steps into the ring on the exact same day.
Right, here come the Sadducees.
Enter the Sadducees.
To understand this next confrontation, we need to look at the profile the study notes provide on the Sadducees. They were essentially the aristocratic, priestly elite of Jerusalem.
Heavy hitters.
Exactly. They were wealthy, politically powerful, and theologically conservative, but in a very specific, rigid way. They completely rejected any concept of the afterlife. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they didn't believe in spiritual things like angels.
And their view of Scripture was super narrow.
Very narrow. Most importantly for this debate, they only accepted the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If a doctrine wasn't explicitly found in those 5 books, they threw it out.
Knowing that, they come to Jesus with this elaborate, highly contrived hypothetical riddle designed to make the entire concept of the resurrection look completely absurd.
It's a very smug question.
It is. They base it on an actual functioning law from Deuteronomy chapter 25, known as the law of levirate marriage. Essentially, in the ancient world, if a man died without having children, his brother was legally required to marry the widow.
This was to provide an heir, keep property within the tribe, and carry on the deceased brother's family line.
Right. So the Sadducees say, okay, teacher, imagine there are 7 brothers. The first one marries a woman and dies with no children. So the second brother marries her to fulfill the law, he dies too. Then the third, all the way down to the 7th brother. Finally, the woman herself dies.
And then they drop the punchline.
So at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since all 7 were legally married to her?
You can almost hear the arrogance in their question.
Yeah.
They think they have definitively proven that a physical resurrection is a ridiculous, unworkable concept that leads to logical impossibilities.
But Jesus systematically dismantles their argument in 2 devastating parts.
Yes, he does. First, he tells them bluntly, you are in error because you do not know the power of God.
He immediately attacks their foundational assumption about what the afterlife even is.
Right. Jesus explains that their fundamental misunderstanding stems from assuming the resurrection is just a continuation of this current earthly life. They think it's just extending the biological status quo into eternity.
Just living the same way forever.
Exactly. He corrects them, stating that in the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven.
Which they don't even believe in.
Right. The sources note that the institution of human marriage exists on Earth for specific purposes: procreation, family lineage, and solving the very problem of mortality that the levirate law was designed to address.
So in a resurrected state of immortality, those earthly functions will simply no longer be necessary.
Exactly. This doesn't mean deep interpersonal relationships won't exist, but that the exclusive legal institution of earthly marriage is superseded by an entirely new, vastly superior reality.
He completely invalidates the premise of their riddle. They were trying to apply the rules of a mortal world to an immortal one.
But he doesn't stop there.
No, part 2 is where he beats them entirely on their own turf. He says, you do not know the Scriptures.
And remember, since the Sadducees only respect the first 5 books of Moses, Jesus doesn't quote the prophets like Isaiah or Daniel to prove the resurrection.
Even though those books contain clear references to it.
Exactly. He goes right to the book of Exodus, chapter 3. He takes them to the story of Moses at the burning bush, a text they claim to hold in the absolute highest regard.
It is a phenomenal piece of theological and legal argumentation. He reminds them of exactly what God said to Moses from the bush. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
Now, the weight of his argument rests entirely on the grammar here. God did not say, I was the God of Abraham, even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been physically dead and buried for centuries by the time Moses encountered that burning bush.
He says, I am.
God says, I am their God. Jesus concludes he is not the God of the dead, but of the living.
It is incredible how much theological weight rests on a single verb tense. He completely dismantles a deeply entrenched elite theology just by pointing out that God says I am, not I was.
If God is currently identifying himself by his relationship to these patriarchs, they must still exist in some form, awaiting the ultimate resurrection.
The text tells us the crowds were completely astonished at his teaching. The Sadducees are effectively silenced.
Which leads us to a fascinating shift in the political dynamics. Watching their elite rivals get publicly embarrassed, the Pharisees don't back down.
They see an opening.
They do. They regroup and decide to send in one of their absolute best, an expert in the religious law, to test Jesus one last time. He asks, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?"
And according to the historical context, this wasn't just a simple trivia question to see if Jesus had memorized the Torah.
Not at all.
The study Bibles explain that the rabbis of the first century engaged in endless, intense, hair-splitting debates about this very topic. They'd combed through the Torah and categorized the law into exactly 613 specific commands.
And they argued constantly over which laws were heavy, meaning the most universally important moral imperatives and which were light.
Like lesser regulations, the exact rules for tithing tiny garden spices, like mint and cumin.
Right. They were demanding that Jesus pick a side in this incredibly complex, partisan theological debate.
And Jesus answers by bypassing their complex categories entirely. He pulls from a prayer that every faithful Jewish person would have known intimately, the Shema, found in Deuteronomy 6.5.
The Holman notes describe how foundational the Shema was. This wasn't just a casual prayer, it was the ultimate declaration of Jewish identity, recited morning and night, and physically written on the doorposts of their homes.
So when Jesus quotes it, he is pulling from the very core of their daily existence. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment.
But then he immediately pairs it with a second law from Leviticus 19.8, love your neighbor as yourself.
He fuses them together. He says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
That is the profound insight here. He is stating that the entirety of the Old Testament scripture is an inseparable, interdependent framework. You cannot genuinely love God with your whole being while treating other human beings who bear his image with contempt.
And conversely, you cannot truly love your neighbor as yourself in a sustaining, sacrificial way, without first being grounded in the ultimate love of the Creator.
It all hangs on this dual hinge. Upward love toward God and outward love toward others. If you get that right, the other 611 laws naturally fall into place.
What does this all mean? Up to this point in the chapter, Jesus has been playing defense, expertly deflecting trap after trap regarding taxes, the resurrection, and the law.
But now he turns the tables.
The Pharisees are gathered around him, and he finally goes on the offensive with a question of his own. He asks them, what do you think about the Christ, the Messiah? Whose son is he?
And they give the standard textbook, completely correct answer of the day, the son of David. All the prophecies agreed the Messiah would be a descendant of King David's royal line.
But then Jesus presents them with a paradox that completely breaks their theological framework. He quotes King David himself, specifically from Psalm 110, verse 1, which was universally recognized by the Pharisees as a prophetic text about the Messiah.
Under the inspiration of the Spirit, David wrote, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet."
The Lord said to my Lord.
Exactly. Jesus points out the logical impossibility based on their limited understanding. In the ancient patriarchal world, a father or an esteemed ancestor would never, ever call his own descendant Lord.
The ancestor was always considered greater and worthy of reverence.
Always. So Jesus asks them, if David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?
The text says no one could say a word in reply. It is the ultimate theological climax of the entire chapter.
When you read the notes in both study Bibles, they clarify that Jesus isn't denying that he is the physical descendant of David. Rather, he is using their own accepted scriptures to expose how terribly small their view of the Messiah actually was.
They were expecting something else entirely.
The religious leaders of the first century expected the Messiah to be merely a human political savior, a great military leader like David who would violently overthrow the Roman occupation and restore Israel's geopolitical tower.
Jesus is showing them that the Messiah is vastly more than a political revolutionary. He is a divine being. He is God incarnate, existing before David, infinitely greater than David, and yet miraculously born into David's earthly lineage.
It is a devastating revelation that shatters the tiny, manageable box they had tried to force a Messiah into. And Matthew notes the definitive result. From that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. The intellectual gauntlet was officially over.
It is just an incredible journey through a single chapter of text. In a short amount of time, we've watched ancient political traps regarding sedition, absurd theological riddles about the afterlife, and hostile legal interrogations all systematically dismantled.
And in the process, we are left with these incredibly profound insights into the nature of civil authority, the reality of the resurrection, and the divine supreme identity of the Messiah.
It truly is a masterpiece of engagement.
It is. And before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the historical reality we've unpacked today. Think back to that tense moment when Jesus held up the Roman denarius.
The coin.
Right. The coin. He pointed out that it belonged to Caesar because it was permanently stamped with Caesar's image and Caesar's inscription. If we take that ancient truth and apply it to our modern lives, we have to ask ourselves a very challenging question.
What's that?
We live in a world of infinite information, endless digital distractions, and constant demands on our loyalty. Our careers, our politics, our social media feeds, our consumer habits, they all want to claim us and shape us. In the midst of all that noise and pressure, whose image and inscription are you letting stamp your own identity today?
What a powerful and necessary question to carry with us into the real world. Thank you all so much for joining us for this deep dive. As you head back out into your day, remember that God deeply loves you and God blesses all the listeners. Take care, and we'll catch you next time.